Welcome to Scope Creep, the show that shines a light on what it's actually like to build a business, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I'm Jamie Cox.
And I'm Liz Talego, and we're both entrepreneurs in the business of building businesses. Every other week, we'll dissect the myths behind being a solopreneur, call out the celebrity entrepreneurs who push the passive income dream, and talk about the real benefits of being your own boss, from choosing how and when you spend your free time to building a career where you call the shots.
Let's take a #unfiltered look behind the proverbial curtain and learn how to build a values-based business where you're healthy and wealthy. No manifestation or vision boards required.
Welcome to episode 2 of Scope Creep. Today, we're talking about the barriers to starting your own business, the internal, the external, the systemic, and what we've learned about how to overcome them or at least deal with them. Be sure to stick around for the end of the episode where we'll be sharing a segment called The Shit You Can't Skip. We'll be highlighting some practical ideas for you to overcome those barriers or at least make a dent in them.
Before we dive in, it's happy hour and we're spilling the tea on how our weeks went, the highs and the lows. My bearded correct.
I love that sound. Sounds delicious.
Yes. So I'm drinking a beer here, Liz, and I am wondering what went good for you this week?
Well, this Zinfandel that I'm sipping on is pretty good, but I have to say work-wise highlight is that I got to bid on a project for a literal dream client, an organization. I can't say who it is, but I am just so stoked to even be in a position where I can send these people an email with an attachment. And I'm trying to be cautiously optimistic because a little bit of imposter syndrome is happening, which we'll get to more on that later. But it would be an absolute dream to work with this organization. They're doing things that are so aligned for me, like value-wise and the way that they work and the people that they support. It would be a really big deal if I got the gig, but if not, I'm excited to be included.
Oh, that's awesome. And I know last time we talked about like dream clients. Do they exist? And sometimes they do.
Yes, they do.
So it's nice to meet them when they come by. Similarly, speaking of dream clients, I just wrapped up a project with somebody. This was kind of the high of my week. And it was a great cross section of my two loves, marketing and fitness. So for those of you who don't know, I was a spin instructor until recently. And so I still have a lot of that fitness background. And that's something that's interesting to me. So I was approached to do some brand strategy for a new fitness brand. And it's been really fun and just fun to work with a fellow athlete on that. And just to kind of tack onto that, they complimented my writing, which I love writing. I trained to be a designer, but writing's kind of where I feel like I shine a little bit more. And they complimented that. Because of that, I wrote a letter to my English teacher from high school just before we started recording to just thank her for teaching me that. And it's like, she taught me a lot more than just writing too. Like she taught me how to be like a human being. So anyway, I just had that nice, it was a lot of good little things that happened because of that project. So that's a high for me. But I mean, I know, it's not all rainbows and sunshine as much as we wish it was. So what's something that totally sucked this week?
So I'm almost afraid to admit this, but in the spirit of transparency and just being real with you guys, I bailed on a conference midway through that was supposed to be for women entrepreneurs.
I can see where this is going.
I am all about women supporting women and building community. That's a huge passion of mine. But it was just not a fit for me. It was not aligned with kind of what I understand the world of entrepreneurship to be. And frankly, I had an inbox that was screaming at me and I had a deal to renegotiate on the fly. And so I kind of took my afternoon back. But it was kind of a bummer because I was really looking forward to it. And it was just kind of one big sales pitch. We'll put it that way.
Ugh, I hate that. Like when you get into a room and you're like, oh, this isn't it. And now I'm here. I have to make a decision that I either leave and people see me leave or I stay and my inbox is just festering in my brain.
Yep, totally. So what about you? What was your low this week?
I am at the very end of a project. And I don't know if you've ever felt this way about a project, but like just when I get to that kind of the last like 3%, is grueling. It's just like the changes. I'm subcontracting on it too. So like I'm not managing the client and I'll just say they're not managing the client the way I would. So anyway, just getting it over the finish line has been painful, and I'm just ready for it to be over. It's like they pay really well. And in this last 3%, I'm like, man, I should have doubled what I charge. And it's not even true. It's just like, I'm ready for it to be over. That's really what it boils down to. So that's the low. And it's been the quote unquote last week of the project for about a month now. So here's to hoping.
Here's hoping. I've been there, and it will come to an end. But I definitely know, like, when things are done, they're done. And it's hard when things just feel like they're not wrapping up. So I hear ya. Okay, so now that we've got that out of the way, today we are here to talk about barriers to being in business. What were the things that made it hard for us to start our businesses? And what are the things that are still hard that we're still trying to navigate? And so one thing we want to kind of acknowledge from the top is we're going to be talking about barriers today that you can hopefully at least address, if not immediately influence. But those are really different than systemic barriers. And we want to acknowledge that if you are a woman identifying person, there are some barriers that you're going to face in starting your business that are frankly beyond your immediate control. We want to be super clear about that. You cannot girl boss or manifest your way out of the very real fact that there's a wage gap that's actually way worse in the gig or freelance economy, and that women earn just 82 cents on the dollar compared to men, or that only 2% of VC funds go to women. You guys know where I'm going with this. These are all stats that are real, and we are kind of living in this reality. But that doesn't mean that there aren't things that we can do to influence those things. So our bottom line with these conversations is to empower you with tools, tactical tips that are ultimately going to help more women get into more positions of power where they can hire other women and start to make a dent in some of this systemic shit. So having acknowledged that and those not so fun facts, let's dive into our barriers. Jamie, before you started your business and you were kind of just thinking about it, what did you think was going to be hard before you dove in?
I mean, I think there were a lot of really tangible things that I thought were going to be hard, and that, I mean, quite frankly, are hard and scary, and they're not set up for us to handle easily. But like taxes, health insurance, like those things are hard. They're not going to get easier. Even I feel like even if you're a CPA, when tax time rolls around, it's a hard time of year. And those are just the things that like you can't girl boss your way out of, like you said. But I think beyond that, the hardest barrier that I had to kind of think through and get over was the idea of security. I felt like being my own boss, being self-employed, that there was an element of insecurity. And that was all built on the idea that my corporate job was secure. And obviously, when the pandemic happened in 2020, it was like, oh, my job isn't secure. Like all of these clients have just disappeared and I'm kind of just floating in space waiting to be let go. So it's like once that happened, it was like, oh, that's kind of a fake fear that I have. A fake barrier, if you will. And I know you have medical background, so I feel like your barriers are probably much different than the ones that I was experiencing.
I feel like I had all the barriers that you just mentioned. For sure. I had no idea how to run a business, but at least I was aware of that. So I have a mental health background. I have a master's in mental health and education. I can tell you that we got about maybe 20 minutes of instruction within that program of, say, like how to get a private practice up and running, right? That was not the focus of my education. I knew what I wanted, but I had absolutely no clue into the systems that you need to set up to ensure that you are stable, so that you do have work consistently coming in, so that client base is there for you consistently. I knew I didn't know how to do that. And on top of that, yeah, I definitely didn't know how to do taxes or health insurance. I actually went without it for quite a while when I first started out. So not so different. I will say one of the other kind of big barriers for me was not having a PhD, which I know sounds like elitist as fuck, but I was so intimidated. I don't have a PhD. It's never been something that I've wanted to pursue in a real way. I dream of escaping back into academia all the time.
Oh, yeah, I feel that.
But because I didn't have these specific letters after my name, I didn't think that I was going to be hireable to do things in kind of the clinical and technical sphere. As it turns out, academics are really smart and they know the clinical side like the back of their hand, but they don't know how to translate that into a digital experience in an app or a content marketing campaign. And I knew how to do that. I just couldn't see that when I was first starting out.
It's kind of interesting too to think, oh, I don't have to do all of that on my own. Like I don't have to have a PhD so I can do that part of it. There are other people that have that and I can collaborate with those. So that's kind of just like the immediate, oh, that's how that barrier overcame itself.
Yeah. And it just took me a little while to realize like I like my lane and I want to stay in it. And I collaborate with really smart clinicians all the time to make sure that the content and the messaging that I'm creating is, rock solid from a clinical standpoint. But we don't do the same things and we don't have the same gifts. And the work is better when you realize you don't have to do it all.
Ooh, yeah. Isn't that the truth? It also feels good when you don't have to do it all. Let me just say that. For anybody out there doing it all, you don't have to.
You don't have to do it all. So looking back, I feel like we've both figured out a way to work our way through these perceived barriers that weren't really barriers, but there are actual barriers and challenges that we've had to overcome and ones that we're still working on today. So Jamie, I'm curious, what were the barriers you did actually have to overcome?
And I feel like what I thought wasn't the reality. Like, yeah, those were barriers, but those definitely weren't the hardest things that I think I would have to face. So one that I immediately think of is just the idea that I didn't really have a blueprint for this life. Like I mentioned in the last episode, I worked for an agency who was kind of doing stuff really like shittily, honestly. And so that was my example that I had. And I've always had this feeling that like my career hasn't been invented yet. And I still in some ways feel this because I just wasn't seeing anybody do brand strategy in a really impactful way that gave brands meaning and purpose and also actually like set business owners up for success. So I think just not having an example or only having bad examples of it was a huge barrier for me because it was a lot of figuring out what do I want this to look like and what is going to be impactful, helpful. And that's kind of a process in and of itself. I experiment, I explore in my process to figure out what fits and what doesn't. And that's ever evolving. What about you? What's like the immediate thing you think of?
Same. In so many ways. I often joke that I made my job up because I kind of did. I was trained in this very specific field of mental health and how to deliver care. And I figured out a way to apply that in the technology and healthcare space. It's skill transfer, right? It's not very sexy, but it can take one far. But what that meant was when I made that transition many years ago, I didn't have a mentor. I didn't really know anybody else that was doing what I was doing in the way that I was doing it. I, like you, had some really bad examples of stuff that didn't sit well with me, both ethically and just strategically. And I knew I wanted to do something different. And I felt strongly that there was a business case for it. And I made that happen. And for a long time, I was the only one like in this very specific niche that I knew. That's changed since COVID and the mental health tech world has kind of exploded.
Yeah, it changed everything.
And most industries, like things have changed. But at the time, I discovered this niche. I became hell-bent on being the best of the best. And it was good for like client acquisition, right? Because I was doing this different thing and it really resonated with people. But I was completely making it up as I was going along, learning what I could, doing the professional development that I could, both within my kind of specialty, but then with also trying to fill all these knowledge gaps that I had in how to run a business. And that is not to say that I don't think a mentor existed out there or that I couldn't have had one. I just didn't. And I didn't know where to ask and I didn't know where to look. And so I, for a really long time, felt pretty isolated in that. And I wish that there was a person I could look to and say, that is what I want to do, or I want to do my version of that. I didn't see that out there, not in my immediate circle, not in my immediate sphere. And to be honest, in some ways, I'm still navigating that.
Something I hadn't even thought of until truly right in this moment is like how scary the idea of getting a mentor is for me even. And I think that kind of comes back to, again, what we talked about last year, like our last episode, like the why am I like this? And I've always had like a rub with authority. And for some reason, a mentor feels like that for me, even though I know it's not. Like in my core, I know a mentor is there to help you. But I'm just like, oh, that's like a barrier in and of itself for me currently. The idea of asking somebody else for help and guidance, because I want to think that I know everything. And you heard it here first. I don't.
Well, that, and I think you and I are both hyper aware of power imbalance and, all those like, can I pick your brain coffee invitation? I think there is a way to do that that's mutually beneficial and isn't just a take from somebody else. But I'm very shy about that. I never want to quote unquote pick somebody's brain for my own benefit and not offer them something in return. And so that I think was a barrier for me looking for a mentor as well.
I know this is a hot topic that we mentioned at the top of this. It does bring in the idea of imposter syndrome too. Like, what can somebody get from me? This person doing my little business over here. Like, what do they have to gain? And I think this can kind of go in a different direction too, but I just love to pause here and hear what your thoughts are on imposter syndrome before we dive into that.
Up next on Who Am I Going to Piss Off Today? I think it's a very real thing. I think confidence matters when it comes to selling a thing, a product, or yourself. And we are flooded with cultural messages around this idea that women don't belong in spaces of power. Women don't belong in executive roles. Women don't own most of the businesses in this country, right? Like, we're not stupid. We got these ideas from somewhere. We are kind of lost in the sauce of that. So I agree that it's an issue, but I think it's so individual. And I think it also gets kind of scapegoated sometimes where it's really not what's going on. And I think to have a more productive conversation about imposter syndrome, and I know you have some thoughts on this as well.
Oh, lots of feelings.
We need to have a little bit more nuance. And I think we need to look at the bigger picture sometimes, because it's not always helpful to call something imposter syndrome if that's not what it is.
Yeah, I feel like I personally used this idea of imposter syndrome. I remember when I first heard this term, for what it's worth, and it was like, oh, it sounds like you have imposter syndrome around being in a managerial role in your job. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, let's call it that. But in reality, I was like, no, my problem is this person doesn't listen to a thing I say. And like, that's the actual problem. And I have feelings of resentment because of that. And it's not productive. So I think, like you said, imposter syndrome becomes the scapegoat for like your actual feelings and experiences. And then you don't know how to deal with them because you haven't named it. You haven't named that, oh, it's actually like I said, resentment. It's actually like a conflict. It's intimidation, all of those things that are very real experiences.
Yeah.
So there's this article in the Harvard Business Review, and I know we've sent it back and forth probably for like 3 years now. I think it comes around in my feed every now and then, and I post it on Instagram every time I see it because it's just so good. But it's called Stop Telling Women They Have Imposter Syndrome. And we'll post a link to this in our show notes. But it's kind of just the idea of corporate spaces were not built for women, and the same experiences that men are having, like, oh, they can get shit done. Well, women can't because there's kind of this like double standard. And so then it's like, oh, you just have imposter syndrome. That's why you can't get it done. No, that is not true.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to read something from that article. The same systems that reward confidence in male leaders, even if they're incompetent, punish white women for lacking confidence, women of color for showing too much of it, and all women for demonstrating it in a way that's deemed unacceptable. And then it goes on to say, half of the women of color surveyed by Working Mother Media plan to leave their jobs in the next 2 years, citing feelings of marginalization or disillusionment, which is consistent with our experiences. Exclusion that exasperated self-doubt was a key reason for each of our transitions from corporate workplaces to entrepreneurship.
That sums it up.
Man.
That sums it up. And I think imposter syndrome is one of those barriers that can definitely straddle the internal, the external, the systemic. But it depends on the person and the situation. I'm just frankly tired of being told that we need to blame women for some lack of confidence or personality flaw when our systems are built for the patriarchy and therefore setting them up to fail. I
think about this too, in like a real barrier for me was people saying like, oh, it sounds like you have imposter syndrome. And in the back of my head, I'm like, that doesn't feel right. Do I need to have that in order to have like my own business? It sounds like everybody else has it. I was like, I'm worried that I have some false sense of confidence around this. And maybe I do, I don't know. But yeah, I think the idea that I didn't actually feel like I had imposter syndrome was a barrier for me because it was just like, oh, everybody's doing it.
I have this really distinct memory of a conversation that we've had in some shape or form multiple times where we're like confiding in each other, almost like whispering into each other's ears, like, you know, this thing that we're supposed to be afraid of. And for you and I, most of the time, we're talking about like setting rates, contract negotiation, like charging your worth. And you and I are saying to each other, that part isn't hard for me. I have no problem with that. Like, why is that so hard for everybody else? That's hard to understand. But then we're being inundated with these messages like, oh, this is a real struggle for most people. And it is. And I don't want to take away from that. But I feel like we've gotten a bit lost in our conversations on this topic for sure.
And I feel like it's kind of like trying to put women in their place almost. Oh, you're not supposed to be commanding a room, able to negotiate, ask what you're worth. Like you're supposed to play this role. Why aren't you? Again, not to say people don't experience imposter syndrome, because and I know in my life I have too. I mean, I mentioned at the top of this that I was in fitness before, and that is like a whole other world of I'm not good enough. Let me tell you. Like,
oh, I believe it.
But in this realm, that doesn't affect me in the same way that I see it imposed on me, I'll say.
I think we're going to be talking about this one for a long time, and that's okay. But there are plenty of other barriers that, you know, maybe aren't as buzzworthy, right? I could list many of them, not the least of which is in light of current events. There's been this cooling that has happened in tech with all these crazy layoffs that have spooked everybody into not wanting to spend their budgets. And you think to yourself, you spoke about, you know, this concept of security back in the beginning and thinking that ultimately the 9-to-5 thing is more secure. I don't agree with that. But that is not to say that as a solopreneur, you aren't subject to kind of the trends of the market and what's going on around you, and that there are just seasons of feast, seasons of famine sometimes, and you hope to hit like a nice steady coast as much as you can, but you can't control all those things. So for me, what's going on in the world right now in tech is definitely having an effect on the number of yeses I get on proposals and the amount folks are willing to spend. And I have no quick fix for that other than to just stay true to my processes, evolve where I can and where it makes sense, and try to be as competitive as possible.
It's also learning to take the downturns as they come too, and how do you make the most of those? And maybe that is, oh, I'm not actively doing work for clients, but what am I doing in that downtime to build business, to improve my processes, like you said, and just kind of making the most of that, knowing it's going to happen. Anybody that's saying like, oh, I'm 100% booked 100% of the time, I would put money on the fact that they're not.
I would double that money. You have to compare apples to apples, right? And very few people who are an army of one like we are. And we do some collaborative work. We work together sometimes. We work with other professionals and other strategists, which is great. And I love and really combats that sense of isolation that I mentioned before. But you can't compare those people to bigger companies with massive budgets and massive lead gen efforts that are always going to be booked and always going to be full. So yeah, like word to the wise listener, if you see somebody that is saying that they're completely booked out all the time and it's just one person, is it possible? Sure. But kind of approach that with some healthy skepticism. I'll say that much.
It's also like, how healthy is that really? I mean, even if you're working full time, I was actually having this conversation with another friend of mine who runs a business, and she was saying like how many billable hours she actually works in a week compared to when we both worked together full time, what that was like. And it's like, well, realistically, she was saying like, I only bill like 25 to 30 client hours in a week. Not to say she's not working the rest of the time, but it's like, I'm thinking about our corporate time together and I'm like, yeah, I mean, even then we didn't really work a full 40 hours a week. Did we? Like, you know, you had the random friend come over to your cubicle and drink a cup of coffee and catch up on the, you know, so it's like, I don't know. I don't believe in 100% of the time in really any aspect of life.
You're talking about a big freaking barrier, which is reality versus the story you might be fed on any given social media platform, including LinkedIn.
Yeah. Looking at you, LinkedIn.
I maintain that one might be the worst for your mental health. I was just researching that today. Because we know anytime that we're exposed to over sanitized versions of reality over and over again, this comparison happens that is not good for our well-being, right? And so I think a barrier for me that I continue honestly to struggle with sometimes is that comparison, which is the thief of joy, which is always setting me up to feel like I'm not whatever enough when I'm not necessarily even comparing myself to something that's real. There's a big difference between working in your business, right? Those billable hours, and working on your business. And there's all different types of activities that go into that. Some are fun, some are very much not fun, but they're all costing you something.
Right. Yeah.
In one way or another.
Yeah. It's like you said last episode too, like every minute of your day, you can charge for it. Like it all has a rate.
Technically, yeah.
Yeah. And you have to choose which ones to give to other people.
And how much to charge.
And how much to charge. Yeah. Yeah. So I feel like another just barrier I want to touch on, kind of going back to our conversation about the corporate world, like how much we actually worked then and how much we work now. I just have this weird barrier that I still experience. And I think that I thought I would experience in the beginning. And that is the idea of perfectionism, and not in the way that people might think. I consider myself a very detailed person. I will say I'm far from a perfectionist though. Like I just don't have that gene in me. And I think I felt like I had to have that in order to run a successful business. Like I had to get everything right. Again, 100% of the time. And I just realized now, like, oh, I can find other people to do those details. I can still do details, but like I can find the other people to be perfectionists and like proof the things that I need them to proof and like let them shine in that. Anyway, that was just a barrier that I felt like I had to overcome. A lot of people are like, oh, I need to stop being a perfectionist. And I was like, maybe I should start.
That's interesting because gosh, well, that hit me in the feels when you said that, because I have never identified as a perfectionist, because like the logic part of my brain is like, that doesn't exist. That's chasing a false narrative, right? And I certainly don't expect that from the people that I care about or the people that I work with. And I love a flawed human, but I spent a lot of time in my business approaching my client communications and client management with this kind of unconscious belief that if I messed up, it was unforgivable. That if I presented anything other than perfect and delivering 110% all the time and zero failure, which in the realm of strategy and creative and communications and content and all the things we do, like there is no such thing as perfect, right? But I put that pressure on myself. And I think that came from, some deeper feelings of maybe I don't feel like I have what it takes to be here. So I have to work extra hard.
Yeah.
And that might be a version of imposter syndrome that does carry some weight.
Yeah. Well, and I think back to this idea of, again, I'm like a really detailed person. So I can dig in, I can read really long emails. I can send really long emails. Sorry, all of my clients, but I have no problem like sifting through information and kind of diluting it to, okay, what do I need to take away from this? I'm really good at that. And I think people equate that to, oh, she's like a super perfectionist, detailed oriented, all of that. That's not really true. But I'll say like in my corporate job, I think part of the reason I felt like, oh, I have to turn into a perfectionist was because I was expected to pick up the slack for, a lot of my male counterparts who are not expected to be detailed or anything because they're men. And then I was the person that was like, okay, I guess I'll go through these details and fix things. And then when they weren't fixed, for some reason, I was the one who got reprimanded. And I'm like, they're not even doing their job. I'm doing their job. Why am I getting in trouble?
Right. Meanwhile, Chad can't even convert a Word document to a PDF.
Come on, Chad.
I know exactly what you're talking about. And what I admire about you is you're one of the only people I've met in my life who, like, you're equally skilled as a project manager as you are a creative.
Thanks. I feel like that might just be my type A showing.
Think from that what you will, but that is an incredible strength as someone who is, I hate project management. Like I hate taking big ideas and, creating a spreadsheet to reflect the steps that you're going to take to achieve those big ideas. That's like not, but I need those people in my life so much. And that even comes back to like, you don't have to do it alone. There are people whose lane that is and they'll really shine. But I imagine going through the world with both those skill sets, it's a barrier in and of itself sometimes.
I think it definitely is. Personally, the barrier that I put on myself is like, oh, I have to do all of these things. And that goes back to yours, which is being siloed and feeling like, oh, I have to do all these things and I have to do them alone. Asking for help is for some reason terrible. I don't understand where I got that idea, but I have it in my head. I think I've cursed myself with that in some ways. And then also just people asking me to do it
Mm-hmm.
if I collaborate on a project. And 9 out of 10 times I don't mind because I find that I am good at getting the information I need from people and skimming through the stuff I don't. And I think that comes with kind of like my own personality. Type 8's in the house.
Yep. Heard.
But I'm curious to hear, though, too, like how you kind of overcame the idea of like you have to project manage because you're doing this.
For sure. I want to be really transparent that when we're having these conversations, if it's not abundantly clear, I want it to be that we are not coming at these problems from a place of having it all figured out. I am very much still trying to figure out how the hell to do that. I recently met a new to me friend here locally who, like you, really has that brain for project management. And we bid on a project together. And looking at the proposal that she created, I essentially brain dumped to her how I was going to approach solving the problem that this end client would potentially want us to solve. And out of that, she strung together this beautiful proposal and she likes it, Jamie.
She really likes it.
She really likes it. And so part of it is one, obviously I have to manage clients. I have to manage projects, even if I'm the only one on them. And so I've developed some systems that automate parts of that. I leverage technology for parts of that, but I'm never going to sit across from you and say, I just love creating proposals. It's just not who I am. So part of it is doing hard things that you don't like because that's part of being a grown up in business.
Oh, yeah, unfortunately.
Unfortunately. And part of it is okay, but like stepping outside of that drudgery and saying, what are other ways I can solve this problem? And for me, it's meeting somebody who, that is their jam. They love that. I had coffee with her this morning, actually. And I have 2 proposals out there in the world. And I said to her, I wish I would have met you before I sent those proposals out. Even if it means less money for me because you have to compensate those people, I said, I would be so happy to give you half my money on these projects because you would have made them better. You would have made them better. The likelihood of me getting a yes on those proposals is higher because I would have collaborated with somebody who's really excellent in that sphere. And so that's breaking me out of my shell of that idea that I have to do it all by myself.
I feel like it's so worth it to give somebody else your money because it's like those pain points, like I was saying earlier, like that 3% that is left on this project, the reason it hurts so much is because it's the part of the project that I don't like to do. It is like the packaging files, fixing all of these little tiny things, making it perfect, which is the stuff I hate. So I'm like, I wish there was somebody else that would do this. And I'm sure there is, but unfortunately, my hands are kind of tied in this specific scenario. But if I could pay somebody else to do that part of it, I would, because, oh my gosh, I would feel so much better. I would feel way less resentment toward this project that I've actually loved doing. But right now it's leaving a bad taste in my mouth.
Yeah.
So I feel like it would save a lot of my own sanity to have those people. And again, to ask for help. That's like the thing. I think that's like the core of this is like, oh, being afraid to ask for help or showing that you need help is for some reason some sort of flaw. And it's not. It's actually a strength. It's a superpower, in my opinion.
Agreed. And in reality, too, I think it's worth mentioning that help can take a lot of shapes and forms. I know in the beginning of my business, I didn't have the money to hire an accountant, hire somebody to handle SEO on my website, hire somebody to create my proposals, all these things that I don't want to do, that I'm not great at. I just frankly couldn't afford it. We're not sitting here today saying that this is the only way to collaborate or this is the only way to get help with this piece and overcoming this barrier. There are all kinds of ways to collaborate with people. And I think, especially if you're on your own in business, just being in the presence, being in community with other entrepreneurs and people who are in business for themselves, these conversations, they kind of happen organically. And there are lots of different ways to receive support. It doesn't have to be somebody that you pay to do a service. It can be somebody that you have coffee with on a Tuesday morning and just bitch about client management. And you walk away from that with your cup a little bit more filled up.
It could be a podcast that you start where you bitch about girl bosses.
Yes.
And you drink a beer.
Guilty as charged. That's what this is.
It truly is.
Very much is an outpouring of frustration and wanting to do something different and not seeing it out there and only feeling better when you could do something about it. I mean, you need other people in your life to do that shit. And we're doing that for each other.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that, like, just to kind of bring the conversation full circle back to barriers, like, oh, I didn't realize how much of a community I didn't have until I started my business. Like, it's kind of the idea that you go out to drinks with your friend when you're working in the corporate world and they're like, oh, how's work? And you're like, oh my God, it sucks. So-and-so sucks, blah, blah, blah. And they can relate because they also probably work a corporate job. But then I might have said this before too, but like when people are like, oh, how's work? And it's talking about a business you own, you're like, man, I hate my boss and my boss is me. And like, they just can't relate to that. So it's really important to like rethink your community when you're starting this to solve immediate problems. Like you said, like if you have a friend that's great at proposals or somebody in your circle does taxes, it's great to engage those people, but it's also just great to have somebody in the trenches with you because you're going to find that you're doing it alone most of the time. And your loved ones are probably sick and tired of hearing it.
Yep. And most of them probably won't understand. They might be able to offer some support, but it doesn't replace being in the company of people that make you feel really seen because they understand, this path that you're walking in a way most folks won't.
Also, I just want to add a plug here that you shouldn't have to pay for those relationships.
No, you should not.
Masterminds.
I feel like that's an upcoming episode conversation for sure. That is not to say you shouldn't pay dues to organizations you're proud to be a part of, but you don't have to buy a 10K, 20K mastermind to feel support from other entrepreneurs or people who are curious about becoming one.
And we've got a list of some of those groups coming up, so stay tuned. So Liz, what are some of the barriers that you are like overcoming today actively? They are on your mind all the time.
Oof, many. I mean, for sure, they're ongoing and they will continue to be because the business that you have today is not going to be the business you have in a year from now. And so that means you kind of have to keep rolling with the punches. One of those punches for me is that I work primarily in a pretty unregulated industry. And when you think healthcare, you don't think unregulated. But I do a lot of work on digital products. Like think about apps and tools that help you maybe manage your depression or increase your well-being in some way that kind of have a clinical bent. Those tools are not regulated in the same way that, say, Tylenol is. We're not there yet. It's a pretty new industry. And so I've been saying for years, and I continue to say this, it's a little bit of the Wild West. And thankfully, there are some leaders in our industry, really mindful, thoughtful clinicians that are trying to establish some standards around messaging and marketing and how we describe the impact that these tools can provide. But we're not there yet. And so there's no playbook. There's no rule book. There's no gold standard. And some founders that I work with are so great, will not sacrifice clinical validity to increase profitability at any point. They really lead with compassion. They really lead with an effort to do the right thing while also having a really sound business model. I love that. They love that.
We love it. We love to see it.
It's good for people. But as I'm sure you can imagine, in this Wild West ecosystem, there are some folks who are doing things that kind of make my hair stand up, that scare me a little bit, that I don't think are necessarily malicious, although maybe, I don't know, but are just ill-informed. And because, like I always say, we're not selling shoes here, people. This is not e-com. We are selling a product or service that folks often need at a time in their life where things are really hard and they're really vulnerable. And we owe it to them to do things the right way. And by the right way, I mean an evidence-based way, a compassionate way. And that doesn't always happen. And so I have to try to really differentiate myself and my personal brand so that I can work with those clients and, those clients that I want to work with can find me and we can work together and steer clear of the other stuff. But there's a whole lot of gray in between, and it's not always easy to figure that out. It's not as simple as niching down. I will sing the praises of that all day long. There's a lot more to it. And so I'm currently kind of navigating that and trying to understand what that means for me, what that means for my business in the future. And I don't have it all figured out. But what about you? What feels like really timely for you right now?
First, similarly, I feel like since 2020, we've seen a rise in strategists, coaches, products, courses, all of this stuff that is unregulated. So trying to educate my potential clients on what makes a good strategy, what makes a good brand strategist, what makes a good partner. Those things are really hard to do in this unregulated Wild West because it's like, oh, it's kind of like any designer is going to be able to relate to this. But like when you have a potential client and they're like, oh, well, I decided my employee's cousin's nephew is going to do my logo instead. Like that's kind of what being a brand strategist feels like right now. It's like, oh, well, this person said they can manage my socials, so don't even worry about that. They've got it. And I'm like, okay, never mind. So just to kind of tack on to what you were saying, I feel like so much of this digital space is unregulated right now. And that is a really hard thing to overcome because there's just no clear path out of it. I honestly don't think a lot of people are talking about that either. Like, I don't think it's at the top of people's minds. Mental health, maybe that's probably a little bit different. I know there's been a lot of like lawsuits and stuff lately that have brought some attention to those spaces. But as far as like the digital product space goes, I don't think it's super common knowledge because people are still being duped left and right.
I know.
But on top of that, I will just say, I think the barrier that I'm like consistently overcoming is taking my own medicine. I spend so much time building brands for other people. And again, anybody in a service-based business is going to relate to this, but like doing it for yourself is
attack
the hard work. Yes. It is just hard to take a step back and look at yourself in that way, I think, first and foremost. But then also on paper, that is not the work that pays me. When I'm working on my own business, or in my own business, I guess I should say, that's not the work that pays me on paper. But I mean, like the proof is in the pudding. And I just have some quick like brag stats that I want to share.
Tell me more.
Let me just toss my hair.
Your green hair.
I'll get ready to read this. So I put this like rebrand that I wanted to do for myself off in 2020 when the pandemic happened. And I was like at this full time, I was like, I got to get something out there, which is the antithesis of what I would tell my clients to do. But screw my own advice. I'm going to do it my way. So anyway, I've been cruising along. It's been fine. But in 2022, I really took the time to dig into what I wanted my business to be, what I wanted it to look like, what I wanted it to sound like, and what problems I was actually solving and who my audience was. Basically, the same things I do for clients every day. So I took the time to do that. And who would have thought that it really helped me out? So, I mean, it's proving itself already. Year over year, I grew my business 30%. Year over year this year. So I'm trending right now to do about the same and grow my business again. So like really just sucking it up, doing the work. It's proved itself. It's also given me a lot more empathy in my business and like, oh yeah, this is really hard work. And I'm asking my clients to do a lot when I'm asking them these questions to get to kind of those like hard answers that maybe are uncomfortable. So anyway, that's just kind of really transformed the way that I've done business, honestly, but it's still something that I have to overcome, like finding the time every day to do the little tiny things that I don't want to do, like update copy on my website sometimes and write blog posts, create content. All of those things are the things I'm encouraging my clients to do. But I am the first person to push them to the wayside when they don't fit in my schedule.
I know. Well, it's almost as if you're saying that showing up for yourself and doing some introspection and being honest about who you are and what you want to do made you a lot more money? Is that what you're saying?
Oh my gosh. I think that is what I'm saying. And
oddly enough,
I know it's taken me a while to get here, but y'all, you're witnessing it firsthand.
It has been very cool to watch your evolution over the past couple of years and have the honor of participating in some of it. It's been very cool. I love that you're sharing those numbers. I think that's powerful. I'm also not surprised.
Oh, thanks.
Well, Jamie, honestly, this has been really helpful for me, if no one else.
Same.
I feel like we talked about some things that I kind of know on a cellular level are likely things that other people are struggling with, but it's just This is such a great example and embodiment of what we were talking about not getting siloed, not getting stranded. For me, even though I'm many years in, I respect the hell out of you. And hearing that you're also struggling with some of this stuff and some of the ways that you've approached navigating some of this stuff is just super helpful. And so I know if it's helpful for me, it's probably going to be helpful for our audience. And so I just really appreciate you in this conversation.
Well, Liz, I know every time I talk to you, I just learn a lot about you and about your business and just how you manage things. So it's always a pleasure. And, sometimes you just don't have time to have these conversations IRL. That's why we have this section, shit you can't skip.
Love it. And couldn't agree more, Jamie. This is always so helpful to me personally, professionally, in all the ways. And so this week's shit you can't skip is all about how to actually start moving the needle on some of these boundaries. Like we said at the top, there are systemic ones that we're not going to change overnight. But keeping a lookout for the things in your life, in your mind, in your business that feel like barriers that are keeping you stuck. And the first step in making a difference with any of those is figuring out what those might be. Some clues that you might want to pay attention to that you don't want to skip, or anything you're talking about where you use the words like can't, never, won't. These are some clues that you might be rubbing up against a boundary that you might need to give a little attention to. And then once you have a better idea of what those might be, and this might not happen overnight, but maybe start categorizing them. Think about whether those barriers and those feelings are coming out of, maybe a knowledge gap, maybe a systemic barrier, maybe a mindset issue, and thinking about which one you want to tackle first, because you can't tackle them all at once, and starting to make some changes around that can ultimately help you move forward. Maybe you have a knowledge gap, like you also hate doing taxes like Jamie and I do. That's totally fine. So start asking around your network. See who's got a good CPA. They do exist, and you might be able to hire one. Maybe you don't feel like you fit that kind of solopreneur or entrepreneur role. Maybe you just don't see yourself in that way, and that's keeping you from moving forward. Well, spend some time thinking about, what does that person look like in your mind? And why don't you feel like you can fill that role? And start thinking about some of those mindset blocks that might be getting in the way. And then lastly, and this one is so important, we've kind of touched on this many times in this conversation, but maybe you don't know anybody who runs their own business. There are many of us, but we can kind of be a little bit isolated. And so in order to build that community and start getting support from other people who are kind of in the trenches with us, start thinking about networks in your local community, digital networks you can tap into, and being on the lookout for those. Jamie, I know we have some ideas for those who are looking for opportunities to connect both in person and online.
Yeah. Liz and I are both parts of several groups locally and nationally, probably even internationally. So we wanted to share some of those here. Ladies Get Paid. I think that might actually be how Liz and I met.
It is.
Lovely story. And some other ones are Freelancing Females. There's a local group in Nashville called Startup Nashville. I fund women out in tech, women in tech. There are tons of groups out there. You just have to know where to look. Lots of them are Slack groups or even message boards, that sort of thing. So just get out there, start Googling, and you will find some. And I just want to end the show on one more note and a reminder for everybody out there that is building something. What makes a great business owner isn't the fact that they have all the answers. It's the fact that they move forward despite not having all the answers.
So well said, Jamie. This has been lovely. So thanks again for a great conversation.
Thank you.
I'll see you next time.
See you next time. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Scope Creep. We're your hosts, Liz Talego and Jamie Cox. We'll be back in 2 weeks to talk about being yourself in your business.
If you loved Scope Creep, leave us a 5-star review. And if you didn't, please leave. You can find us on TikTok and Instagram at Scope Creep Show. You can find Jamie at JMER Cox and Liz at LIZTALAGO. If you have a specific topic you'd love for us to discuss or a question you want answered, you can always email us at scopecreepshow@gmail.com.
Until next time, stay creepy.